Hello, my name is Shephard, and today I will be talking about the D.B. Cooper case. This was a case that was back in 1971 regarding D.B. Cooper. This man was somebody who hijacked a Boeing 727 plane in mid-flight after purchasing a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. After he's accomplished hijacking the plane, he had taken demand for multiple parachutes and $200,000 in specifically $20 bills only. During the flight, D.B. Cooper planned his escape with these parachutes and the money after departing from the back of the plane during the flight. After he departed from the plane, Cooper was never to be found afterwards. The case ended up going cold until 9 years later when a boy came across some older-looking money in the Columbia River while he was camping. Though D.B. Cooper was never found, 9 years later in 1980, some of the money was eventually found by a young boy on the Columbia River beach area, specifically known as Tennabar, was found just below the sand's surface. So up in the right-hand corner, you'll kind of see it's a map of the flight path of the plane, and it shows the small area where the original suspected landing zone was. However, then you see over to the left and down a little bit that's roughly where that estimated $6,000 was found by this young boy. It is believed by special forces that D.B. Cooper was not able to survive his jump for many simple reasons, because that night was not the greatest weather condition, and D.B. Cooper's knowledge of that specific landing area was little to none. So during this flight, as I spoke earlier, D.B. Cooper jumped out of the back of the plane. He jumped out through the air star on the plane, which is the bottom opening of the aircraft. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see that plane, the picture of the Boeing 727. That is the exact plane that D.B. Cooper jumped out of. So you can kind of see on the bottom end, there's like a bright light underneath the airplane, and right in front of, right behind that last tire, it kind of looks like a cop car, but it's not. And that bright white light area has a ramp that comes down. That's where D.B. Cooper jumped out of. That air stair area stayed open during the entire flight after he jumped out until they landed safely in Seattle, Washington. And luckily, there were no known injuries that were reported. Moving into the specifics of the biological organisms and processes that were used during this investigation, after the estimated $6,000 was located, the FBI began investigation on this unsolved D.B. Cooper hijacking case. The bills that were found still had intact rubber bands around them. However, everything was so badly degrading, and it kind of showed them that there was no actual intent of this money being buried underneath the sand surface. Investigations went on with diatom testing, due to them being approximately 98% of the total plankton within the Columbia River. Diatoms are used to help make out a specific timeline of when the event occurred. So it's basically helping us with seasonality. The testing was for the genera and the abundance that was undertaken on a single Cooper bill from that estimated $6,000 that was found by the little boy. And it was we also had two modern bills that were submerged in the same area that these bills were found in, so the Columbia River, in March and November for a direct comparison.
So we're going to be discussing the D.B. Cooper money case rebuttal. So D.B. Cooper was a hijacker that was they claimed to have jumped off a plane after hijacking money from the passengers, and said that this event occurred around November 24th, 1971, and his body was never found. They didn't have any physical evidence until 9 years later, in which a young boy, Brian Ingram, was digging up or creating a pit, and he found $6,000 worth of monies that were rolled up, which they believed to have been part of the Cooper ransom because the serial numbers matched, which is very telling in itself. So they took a few samples. So they had a single sample, a single original Cooper bill that was owned by Brian Ingram. They sampled analysis for that, as well as they had other modern bills that they soaked in the Columbia River on November 13th, which was 11 days prior to the hijacking, which could make a difference in the type of analysis or in the type of results that they found. And they only soaked it for 15 minutes, which is drastically different than 9 years or even 3 years soaking in the Columbia River. They had a third set of samples that was collected, in which they had 500 milliliters of Columbia water taken on March 1st from the river, and they soaked a modern bill in that water sample as well. So ultimately, these are the types of diatoms that they were looking at that they found on the bills. They focused more so on the Stereonella and the Fragillaria diatoms, which are the larger diatoms. And so they found that in the Cooper bill. They found a lot of these, a large quantity of these on the Cooper bill. These are generally from like May to June, September, and then they also have some from all year round. Some diatoms that were from July, September to April. And then they have the Cimbella and the Navicula, which they did not find any of the Naviculas on the Cooper bill, but they did find the Cimbella, and they didn't find the Cimbella on the November or March bill, but they found the Navicula on the November bill. So basically, because of the inconsistencies basically that they found with these diatoms, they determined that if the bills were submerged for extended period of time, they should have, and had been in there for multiple seasons, that they should have multiple different diatom species found in the bill, in which they did for the Cooper bill. They did find multiple different types of species from all throughout the year on the Cooper bill. But you have to note that diatoms do die over time, and they sink. So it is possible that some of these diatoms that could have been present in November died off over time, and were no longer, sufficiently attached to the Cooper bill. Another thing to note is that climate change was an issue. So about 1979, climate change was announced to be a serious problem, and the temperatures began to rise around that time. So this is going to affect the type of diatoms that they would find on these two modern samples that they did. So as you can see, and then they found also with this climate change that the larger diatoms were the ones that were decreasing in volume, and the smaller diatoms were still present, but the larger diatoms were decreasing in volume. And as you can see, based on their samples, by the time they hit the March bill, a lot of these diatoms that were larger were not found. And these hotter times of the year, because these temperatures are rising, it's messing with the nutrients in the water. These nutrients are decreasing, and so they're not finding certain nutrients on these bills as well that they found on the Cooper bill. So is it to say that the monies found buried were not the same monies found from the Cooper hijacking? It cannot determine that was not the monies based off of these diatoms, because it is possible that over time, as climate change happened, as the temperatures and the conditions of the river began to change, the diatoms were also changing. Some of them are dying off. The larger ones are dying off. and no longer found in certain areas or found in smaller volumes in certain areas, which could be an indication of why these diatoms or certain diatoms were no longer able to be found in high quantities on these new bills that they tested. Thank you.
This is Student 3, Case Study 4, Rebuttal. Drowning death is described as a death caused by total immersion in a liquid, with hypoxemia and irreversible cerebral anoxia being the mechanisms in acute drowning. Although there are certain common indicators of drowning, it is difficult to confirm a drowning death when post-mortem signs are impossible to locate in the case of dead bodies. Drowning is one of the most challenging diagnoses in forensic pathology, hence a plethora of tests have been developed to provide confirmation of a victim's death by drowning. One of these tests is a diatome test, which serves as an essential aid in the diagnosis of drowning deaths. Diatome count may be utilized to distinguish between the drowning and non-drowning cases. Because the detection of diatoms in tissue may aid in the diagnosis of drowning, an effective technique of extraction and microscopic inspection of diatoms from tissue is essential. The preceding studies demonstrate the importance of diatome tests in the medical legal analysis of drowning incidents. However, some doubt regarding the reliability of the diatome test cannot be thrown out. Few researchers have reported finding diatoms in tissues and bone marrow of people who died by causes other than drowning. However, if sufficient care is taken with all criteria and analysis is completed without contamination, it is indicated that it may serve as a substantial supporting evidence in criminal investigations. In the terms of contamination during sample processing, it is widely understood that tools, gloves, papers, water supplies, and chemicals are all possible sources of contamination, and that tap water may contain diatoms. However, in current research, all precautions are taken to prevent contamination, and the use of tap water is strictly prohibited throughout the sample preparing method. The medical legal value of the diatome test for drowning may be greatly increased by enhancing its sensitivity. The use of polymerase chain reaction to amplify the minute amounts of diatome genome deposited in bone marrow. These three case studies are actually from Ramon. I read his article that he used as a reference, and I added a couple of more. I found it very interesting. I needed more information, I felt, in his thing. I really didn't understand where diatoms actually came into the D.B. Cooper case until I was reading, and diatoms also were used in the D.B. Cooper case. But I want to finish this because it also talks about what methods and techniques these cases took on and how they actually did the procedures for these deaths. So finally, 5 instances described in the research presented were solved by employing the diatome test for drowning, and it is shown to be highly important by presenting the exact cause of death. Research was carried out by Forensic Science Laboratories Biology Division in India, and all of the cases presented here are freshwater drownings. Following the postmortem of the deceased, internal organs, which is the sternum, clavicle, femur, and lungs, as well as water samples from the bodies that were retrieved, were submitted to the laboratory as crime evidence. Cases were opened and handled in accordance with established procedures, and this is where I find it interesting. In each instance, the exhibits were placed in separate jars. Each jar holding the sternum, clavicle, femur, and lungs received about 50 cc's of nitric acid. The samples were left undisturbed overnight before being cooked for half an hour the following day. A transparent yellow solution with a fat layer on top was produced. The fat layer was removed and the remaining samples were centrifuged for 10 minutes at 4,000 RPM. The centrifugation procedure was done 3 times in the same manner. Supernatant was discarded and the pellets were rinsed with distilled water before being centrifuged again. After washing the pellets, the microscopic slides were made, dried on a hot plate, and examined under a microscope with immersion oil. Slides were also made from water samples supplied to the laboratory where the drownings may have occurred. The diatom species detected in organ samples and water samples were compared, and relationships were formed as a result. On the D.B. Cooper bill, the diatom that they found was Astronella, which was discovered. The genus population peaks in May and June, and numbers are fairly low throughout the winter months, thereby non-existent in the river in November, but that's when Cooper made his leap. Chaim Mauser discovered additional diatoms on the bill that were common in the warmer months. In fact, comparing experimental November bill, a contemporary bill emerged in the Columbia River in November, to the Cooper bill produced to match in terms of the diatoms found on the bills. They also know that the bills were not submerged for several reasons. If that were the case, the bills would have species from each season on it. Finding the summer diatoms disproves the theory that Cooper landed in the river in November, soaked the money, and then buried it on shore. A summertime immersion of subsequent burial shifts the money discovery totally away from the hijacking incident in November. Rubber bands that were wrapped around the bundles of dollars were intact and deteriorated, indicating that the burial happened before lengthy exposure to the weather, which was known swiftly as aged rubber. So it looks like the ransom money was exposed to the Columbia River throughout the summer, then found its way to the Tennebar before the season changed, and finally buried in the sand before too much time has passed.
This is James David, and this is the rebuttal for case review done by Group 10 on the D.B. Cooper hijacking involving a $200,000 ransom money that was found. Just a quick recap. On November 24th, 1971, D.B. Cooper bought a one-way ticket on a flight bound for Seattle, Washington. Dan Cooper was known to be a quiet man who appeared to be in his mid-40s, wearing a business suit with a black tie and white shirt. While not so quiet, Cooper hijacked the plane and demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. While still in flight, he jumped out of the plane with parachutes and money. While the plane did land safely, Cooper had disappeared and was never found. Quick top photo is the $20 bill from the hijacking, which was badly degraded around the edges. The blue box is marked areas sampled for investigation, where the red plus marks location of Fragilia diatoms. The bottom photograph is additional images of money found. The FBI's best guess is that Cooper did not survive the jump for several reasons. The rainy and dangerous conditions for skydiving on the night of the hijacking, the lack of proper equipment, the landing area being a wilderness, and the lack of detailed knowledge Cooper had of this landing area. As for the money, money was found in the Columbia River beach known as Tennebar, north of Portland, Oregon. While the plane did land safely, Cooper had disappeared and again was never found. The FBI officially suspended active investigation of the case in July of 2016. The crime remains an unsolved case of air piracy. The rest of the ransom money never turned up even after decades, suggesting it was never even spent. What's unique about this case is the talk of diatoms making the material of their timeline. So diatoms are a photosynthetic eukaryotic algae found in waters around the world. Some diatom species have a broad variation in seasonal abundance, leading to the possibility that diatoms could constrain the time of year when an object was immersed in water. In this case, it would be the $20 bills that were later found. So in the Columbia River, diatoms make approximately 98% of the total plankton. A diatom survey for genera and abundance was undertaken on a single Cooper bill, and 2 current bills submerged in the Columbia River in March and November for direct comparison. This is just analyzed samples that were taking that values reflect the number of individual cells identified and normalized to quantity per square centimeter. So these were tests that were done on the $20 bills. So on the Cooper bill, there were several instances of Asterinola. Fragillaria was discovered thriving in well between 2 layers of bills. The bills that were buried in the sand and then flooded with diatom-rich water showed some diatom infiltration around the edges. The bottom right image is an actual fractured but associated Astronella found in one of the Cooper bills. Here, diatoms are utilized to limit the time of year before money is buried on the tenor bar. It is thought that diatoms were used for the first time to confine a seasonal time frame. Therefore, the basic mythology has no precedent and will need to be confirmed in future studies. Just some notes on the case. So the Cooper bundles were found just beneath the sand surface, 15 meters up from the water line. The rubber bands were found intact but degraded on the bundles. They suggest that they were initially buried without significant exposure to the elements, which is known to rapidly degrade them. So combining operations took place on the river, and sand was dumped slightly upstream of the burial location and could have contributed to additional sand on top of the bills. So concluding that the mix of genera, abundance, and element signatures suggests that Cooper bills did not get submerged during the November event, but more closely aligned with a May-June timeframe. So diatoms have proven themselves as forensic tools, especially in the area of drowning and in certain cases where a local water body had uniquely identifiable species that were found on victims or evidence. So 50 years later, and the case still remains unsolved. Whereas for the Boeing, it awaits scrapping at Greenwood LaFayette Airport in Greenwood, Mississippi.